When I was 8 months pregnant with twins, my own mother-in-law sat me down at my kitchen table and asked me to give one of my babies away, before either of them had even been born. She called it a gift. It took me almost a year to find out what it actually was. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I tell true, real-life family stories just like this one every week. So if you like stories about family, betrayal, and the moments people finally stand up for themselves, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you're already part of this community, thank you for being here. Please give this video a like before we start. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know, and it lets me know you want more stories like this. Now, get comfortable, because this one has a twist near the end that I promise you will not see coming. Here's my story. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who had to fight for her own children, but that's exactly what happened to me, and I want to tell you the whole story, from the beginning, because I think a lot of you will recognize pieces of yourselves in it. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and before any of this happened, I would have told you my life was ordinary in the best possible way. I married my husband Mark when I was 25. We bought a small house outside of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom with a crooked porch step neither of us ever got around to fixing. We had our first son Noah when I was 27, and our daughter Lily 2 years after that. 2 kids 2 years apart, a mortgage, a minivan with a cracked bumper. Ordinary, good. The one thing that was never quite ordinary was my mother-in-law Diane. Diane raised Mark and his older brother Ryan mostly on her own after their father passed when the boys were young. I respected that. I told myself for years that whatever sharpness I saw in her, the way she corrected how I folded towels, the way she'd hold Noah just a little too long before handing him back, like she was reluctant to let a piece of the family out of her hands, came from a place of having had to hold everything together alone. I gave her grace. I gave her a lot of grace, looking back. Ryan, Mark's older brother, married a woman named Patricia about a year before Mark and I got married. Patricia came from money. Her family owned a chain of dental practices across 3 counties, and Diane never quite stopped talking about it. Not in a cruel way, not at first, just little comments. Patricia's family has such beautiful taste. Ryan's doing so well for himself, that kind of thing. What Diane didn't say, for years, was that Ryan and Patricia couldn't have children. I only found out by accident at a Thanksgiving dinner when Patricia excused herself from the table in tears after someone made an offhand joke about babies. Mark told me quietly in the car that they'd been trying for almost 8 years. IVF, 3 rounds, nothing had worked. I felt for them, genuinely. I remember squeezing Mark's hand and saying we should invite them over more, so they wouldn't feel so alone in it. I had no idea what that sympathy would cost me. Part 2. The news. When I found out I was pregnant a 3rd time, Mark and I weren't exactly trying, but we weren't exactly careful either. We talked about maybe wanting one more, someday. Someday came early. At the 12-week ultrasound, the technician got quiet in that particular way that makes your stomach drop. And then she smiled and turned the screen toward us. 2 heartbeats, she said. Twins. Mark actually laughed out loud, a startled, disbelieving laugh, and grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. I cried right there on the table, half from shock and half from something that felt like joy trying to fight its way through fear. 2 more babies. 4 kids total, all under the age of 6. I remember doing the math on daycare costs in my head and feeling a little sick, and then deciding I didn't care. We would figure it out. People figured out harder things than this. We told the family at Sunday dinner 2 weeks later. Mark stood up at the table, grinning like a kid, and announced it. I will never forget the look on Diane's face. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even surprise. Not really. It was something closer to calculation, a flicker so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then she smiled, stood up, and hugged me, and said all the right things. "Oh, Claire, twins, how wonderful!" But something in my chest had already gone cold and alert, the way it does when an animal senses a change in the weather before the sky does. I didn't say anything to Mark. What was I going to say? That his mother's smile looked wrong for half a second? He would have thought I was being paranoid, hormonal, ungrateful. So I swallowed it. I wish now that I hadn't. Part 3. The suggestion. It started small, the way these things always do. Around 20 weeks, Diane began stopping by more often. She'd bring soup, fold Noah and Lily's laundry, sit with me while I put my feet up. I started to think maybe I'd misread that look at dinner. Maybe she really was just excited to be a grandmother of 4. Then, one afternoon in my 7th month, while Mark was at work and the kids were down for a nap, Diane sat across from me at my own kitchen table, wrapped her hands around a mug of tea she hadn't touched, and said the words that would break something in me that has never fully gone back together. "Claire, honey, I want to talk to you about something. Woman to woman." I remember thinking, in the half-second before she continued, that she was going to offer to help with childcare. I was almost relieved. "You're having 2 babies," she said. 2! On top of Noah and Lily. That's 4 children under 6 years old, Claire. Do you understand what that will do to you? To your body, your marriage, your sanity? She reached over and patted my hand, and I remember how badly I wanted to pull it away and couldn't quite make myself do it. I raised 2 boys alone, and I nearly lost my mind. I don't want that for you. "We'll manage," I said carefully. "People have 4 kids all the time." "I know they do." She smiled, and it was the same smile from the dinner table, the one that didn't reach her eyes. But not everyone has a solution sitting right in front of them. I asked her what she meant. I already knew, somewhere underneath, but I needed to hear her say it out loud because some part of me refused to believe a person could actually ask this of another human being. "Ryan and Patricia have been trying for 8 years, Claire. 8 years. Patricia's 39 now. This might be her last real chance at ever holding a baby that feels like family. You're having 2. You wouldn't even be losing a child. You'd still have one of the twins plus Noah and Lily. 3 children is a beautiful, manageable family, and the baby wouldn't be gone. He'd be right here. He'd grow up 2 miles away, at every holiday, in every photo. He'd just have an easier life." Patricia's family has resources you and Mark will never have. Private school, a trust fund, no debt. Think about what you'd actually be giving that child. I sat there in my own kitchen, 8 months pregnant, and listened to my mother-in-law describe giving away one of my unborn children like she was describing a kind and generous gift. I told her no. I told her that these were not extra babies, not spares, not a solution to somebody else's grief. They were my children, and I would raise every single one of them myself, in this house, with this cracked linoleum and this mortgage, and that I never wanted to hear her say anything like that again. She patted my hand one more time, stood up, rinsed her untouched tea down the sink, and said, "Just think about it, sweetheart. Nobody's asking you to decide today." Nobody was asking me to decide at all. That was the part I didn't understand yet, that in her mind, this had already been decided. I sat at that table for a long time after she left, one hand resting on my belly, feeling one of the twins shift and roll under my palm. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should apologize to whichever one of them she meant, as if they could hear her, as if some part of them already understood they'd just been priced. I didn't know yet which twin she pictured handing over. I didn't know if she'd thought that far, or if to her it genuinely didn't matter which one, as long as one of them stopped being mine. That night I couldn't eat dinner. Mark asked what was wrong, and I almost didn't tell him, because some small, ashamed part of me was already rehearsing how unreasonable I'd sound, repeating it out loud. That's the thing nobody tells you about a request like that. It doesn't just wound you, it makes you doubt your own right to be wounded. Part 4. The silence that followed. I told Mark that night. I sat him down after the kids were asleep, and I repeated the conversation almost word for word, my hands shaking the whole time. He went very quiet. Then he said, "That's insane, Claire. I'll talk to her." He did talk to her. I know he did, because Diane didn't bring it up directly to me again for weeks. But something shifted in the family after that. A coolness, a set of conversations that would stop abruptly when I walked into a room. Patricia started texting me things like, "I know this whole situation is complicated. I just want you to know I'd never want you to feel pressured," which was, in its own way, worse than silence, because it told me the conversation was very much still happening, just not in front of me. Mark, to his credit, told me over and over that it wasn't going to happen, that it was his mother being his mother, that I shouldn't worry. But I noticed he never quite told her to stop. He'd say, "Mom, that's not going to happen," and then days later I'd hear him on the phone with her, voice low, saying things like, I know she's stressed. I know you mean well. Just give her some space, okay? Like I was the problem. Like my refusal to give away my child was a mood that needed managing rather than the only sane response to an insane request. I started keeping a folder. I don't fully know why I started it. Some instinct, some animal sense of self-preservation. I saved every text from Patricia. I wrote down with dates every conversation Diane and I had. I told myself I was being paranoid. I kept doing it anyway. There was one moment, around 34 weeks, that I still think about. Diane came to a doctor's appointment with me. Mark was stuck in a meeting he couldn't get out of, and I'd made the mistake of mentioning the appointment time in front of her. In the waiting room, while we sat under fluorescent lights surrounded by other pregnant women, she leaned over and said, quietly, almost gently, "You know, if it's a boy and a girl, it would just make sense for Ryan and Patricia to take the girl. Patricia's always wanted a daughter. And you already have Lily, so you wouldn't be without one." I stared at her. A stranger 2 seats down glanced over, like even she had felt the wrongness of it in the air. "There is no version of this where that happens," I told her, low and even, my hands flat on the arms of the chair to keep them from shaking. "Not the boy, not the girl, not either of them. If you bring this up one more time, I will ask Mark's aunt to drive me to every appointment from now on, and you will not be told when or where they are." She didn't answer. She just looked forward, jaw tight, and when my name was called, she said she'd wait in the car. I sat through that ultrasound alone, watching 2 small heartbeats flicker on the screen, and cried harder than I had in years, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, lonely fury of having to defend children who hadn't even been born yet. Part 5. The Birth. The twins came 3 weeks early in the middle of a Tuesday night, fast and hard the way second and third labor sometimes are. A boy and a girl. We named them Owen and Grace. I was exhausted in a way I don't have words for. The kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes and doesn't leave for months. Mark stayed with me at the hospital those first 2 nights, and his mother came to help, which meant she was at the hospital constantly, holding the babies, cooing over them, telling every nurse who walked past how blessed this family was. On the 3rd day, groggy from painkillers and stitches, still bleeding, barely able to sit up without help, I woke from a nap to find Diane in the room alone with both babies and a woman I didn't recognize standing near the window with a folder of paperwork. I asked, in a voice that didn't sound like mine, who that was. Diane's face did something complicated. A flash of irritation quickly smoothed over. "This is Marjorie, honey. She's a family friend. She does paperwork for adoptions within families sometimes. Totally informal, nothing binding. I just thought while everyone was here..." I don't remember standing up. I remember the pain of my incision as I did it, and I remember my own voice, raw and shaking, telling that woman to leave my hospital room immediately, and telling Diane that if she ever brought anyone near my children again without my permission, I would call security, and then I would call a lawyer. Marjorie left. Diane cried, called me hysterical, said she was only trying to help a desperate family before it was too late, that adoptions within families happened all the time, and there was nothing sinister about it, that I was overreacting to a woman with a folder. I asked her to leave too. She did, eventually, after Mark came back from the cafeteria and found me sobbing and shaking, with Owen and Grace both pulled protectively against my chest, and after I told him, calmly, that either his mother was never alone with our children again, or I was taking all 4 kids and going to stay with my sister in Michigan until he figured out which family he actually belonged to. Part 6. What I Found. That was the moment something in Mark finally cracked open. Not toward me, but toward the truth about his mother. He started asking real questions, not the soft, deflecting kind he'd been asking for months, but real ones. Why now? Why the pressure to do it before the twins even left the hospital? Why it had to be handled quietly, informally, with a woman named Marjorie and a folder, instead of through any of the legal channels a family that genuinely wanted to help would have used from the start. Diane's answers kept shifting, and Mark noticed. First she said Marjorie was just a family friend helping with paperwork. Then, when he pushed, she said it was informal guardianship, nothing legal, just so Ryan and Patricia could start bonding early. When he asked to see the paperwork himself, she said she'd already shredded it to avoid upsetting me further. That was the detail that finally did it, the shredding. Mark told me later that his mother had never in his entire life thrown away a piece of paper she didn't want traced back to her. 2 weeks after the hospital, Ryan called and asked if we'd come for dinner, just to clear the air, he said, sounding exhausted in a way that made me almost feel sorry for him. I almost didn't go. I remember standing in front of the mirror before we left, Owen strapped to my chest in a carrier because he wouldn't settle for anyone else yet, and telling my own reflection that whatever happened at that table, I was walking out of it with all 4 of my children still mine. We got our answer that night, and it wasn't the answer any of us expected. It turned out this had never really been about Patricia's grief, or Ryan's happiness, or even tradition, though Diane had wrapped it in all 3. Patricia's father, the one who owned the dental practices, had 6 months earlier told Ryan privately that he was restructuring his estate. Grandchildren would inherit shares of the business directly. Childless heirs would not. Ryan, drowning in guilt and shame about the infertility he blamed himself for, had let it slip to his mother in a moment of weakness. And Diane, practical, sharp, always thinking 3 moves ahead, had decided that the fastest, cleanest solution wasn't more IVF or adoption from an agency, both of which take years. It was a baby already in the family. A baby who would keep the money, the name, and the bloodline all in the same place, with none of the mess of outsiders. She had never asked me to give up a child out of love for Ryan and Patricia's suffering. She had asked me to give up a child to protect a business inheritance. I said this out loud, at that dinner table, in front of everyone, Ryan, Patricia, Mark, and Diane herself. For a second, nobody moved. Then Patricia set down her fork so carefully it barely made a sound, which somehow frightened me more than if she'd thrown it, and asked her husband, in a voice gone completely flat, whether it was true. Ryan didn't answer right away, and that silence answered for him. When he finally spoke, it came out in pieces. Her father's comment about the estate, the shares, the way he'd mentioned it to his mother, almost as a passing worry one night on the phone, never imagining she'd turn it into a plan. I never asked her to do any of this, he kept saying, to Patricia, to me, to the table in general, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less damning if he repeated them enough. I never asked for a baby. I just wanted this whole thing with your dad to stop hanging over us. Patricia turned to Diane. You told me this was about family, she said. You told me you just wanted to see me happy. You let me think Claire was being selfish for saying no. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I understood, watching her, that some part of her had genuinely wanted to believe the softer version of the story, that a baby could arrive out of love instead of leverage. Watching that belief collapse in real time was its own kind of grief. I watched Diane, for the first time in the 8 years I'd known her, have absolutely nothing to say. Part 7. After. Patricia, it turns out, was more disgusted by all of it than any of us. She told Diane, right there at the table, that she would rather never have a child at all than raise one that had been treated like a line item in someone else's inheritance plan. She and Ryan started their own adoption process a few months later, through an actual agency, with an actual family who chose them, and from what I hear, they're doing beautifully now. No strings, no shame, no folders. Diane didn't apologize to me that night or for a long time after. She tried for a while to paint herself as the injured party, a grandmother who only wanted to help, torn apart by an ungrateful daughter-in-law. But Mark, finally, fully, stood where he should have stood from the very beginning. He told her that if she ever again treated one of his children like a transaction, she wouldn't be a grandmother to any of them. Not Noah, not Lily, not Owen, not Grace. It took almost a year and real, uncomfortable distance before Diane came to me, not to Mark, to me directly, and said she was sorry. Actually sorry, not performing sorry. She showed up on a Saturday morning without calling first, which she knew I hated, and stood on that crooked porch step we'd still never fixed, and asked if she could come in and talk. I almost said no. I let her in anyway, mostly because Owen had woken up from his nap crying for reasons I couldn't figure out, and I didn't have the energy to hold a grudge and a screaming toddler at the same time. She sat at the same kitchen table where she'd first said the words that started all of this, and she cried. really cried, not the composed, camera-ready tears I'd seen from her before, and said that watching Patricia's face collapse at that dinner table had shown her exactly what she'd become. She said she'd spent so many years being the one who held everything together after her husband died that she'd started believing that made her entitled to decide what holding it together meant for everyone else too, even grown women with children of their own. She didn't ask me to forget it. She just asked if there was any way, over time, to earn her way back in. I told her the truth, that I didn't know yet, that trust wasn't something she could apologize her way back into in one Saturday morning conversation, no matter how many tears were in it. But I also told her that I wasn't interested in keeping my children from their grandmother out of spite, as long as she understood, completely and permanently, that every single one of them belonged to me and to Mark, and to no one else's plans. She nodded. She's kept to it, mostly. Slowly, carefully, on my terms this time, not hers. Owen and Grace are 2 years old now. They have Noah's stubborn chin and Lily's loud laugh, and neither one of them will ever know how close they came to being divided up like property before they'd even open their eyes for the first time. I think about that folder I kept sometimes, the one full of dates and texts and half-remembered conversations, the one I built out of some instinct I couldn't name at the time. I think about how easy it would have been to talk myself out of trusting that instinct, to tell myself I was being dramatic, oversensitive, ungrateful for a family that only wanted to help. I wasn't. And if there's one thing I want anyone listening to this to take away from my story, it's this. If something in your gut tells you that what's being asked of you isn't love, however kindly it's dressed up, listen to it. Fight for what's yours. Nobody else is going to do it for you. Thank you for listening to my story.